Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. It's great to see so many of you here on a Sunday. I'm excited to share some of our recent research we actually just presented last month at the American Association of Equine Practitioners meeting. Entitled Pre-Race Inflammatory Biomarkers and Race Performance in Thoroughbreds. As a brief overview, just going to give you, I know it's early on Sunday, but we'll talk real briefly about inflammatory gene expression analysis, which is really the backbone for what we do in our lab. Talk again briefly about the inflammatory response to exercise before delving into our study and then our future directions. This undoubtedly will bring back nightmares for some of you from biology class. What we do in our lab is we look at messenger RNA. So as a reminder, we all have DNA in our cells. That DNA is what is called derived or via transcription into messenger RNA. This messenger RNA that we actually measure as part of our method. Most people would be more familiar with messenger RNA being translated into proteins. And so we are not actually measuring proteins, we are measuring upstream of that, looking at that messenger RNA. We utilize special commercially available tubes that will actually selectively stabilize that messenger RNA and keep it stable and intact for long-term storage and isolation. Messenger RNA is usually really hard to work with, and so these tubes make that easy. And then we use what's referred to as quantitative PCR, or qPCR, that allows us to, in a very sensitive and specific manner, so we know what we're measuring is in fact what we want to measure. It allows us to do that in a quantitative way so that we can compare sample to sample, horse to horse, time point to time point. A lot of work has been done in humans looking at the inflammatory response to exercise, and in particular high-intensity exercise. And the amount of work that's been done in horses is limited, but it is still there. And this is a study that looked at horses exercise to exhaustion on a treadmill. And if we look at in whole blood, again, messenger RNA, interleukin-1, which is a very prototypical or very common pro-inflammatory marker. It takes up to 2 hours to increase significantly and stays increased until about 6 hours post-exercise. While when we look at something like tumor necrosis factor alpha, another also well-known pro-inflammatory marker, it actually takes 6 hours. And so a lot of this is the basis for what we do. We know that exercise will induce inflammation in horses. And that really is the result of a variety of different things. So it can be mechanical damage to muscle, soft tissue, bone. It can also be due to, especially during strenuous anaerobic exercise like sprinting, can cause lactic acid or free radical accumulation. Those things can be damaging to the tissues. And it's also due to the release of what are referred to as damage-associated molecular patterns, or DAMPs. And I'm not going to get into the mechanisms of those, there's a lot of them, but ultimately they will result in, again, the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, so ultimately what we're measuring. Now, it is normally associated with the adaptation to exercise, this inflammation, and it's actually necessary for muscle repair and muscle and skeletal repair processes. And I'll talk about that at the end and some ways we may actually be interfering with that. So we have inflammation, but we also have exercise adaptation or conditioning. A lot of us are familiar with that. If we work out, we do the same thing over and over again, our body adapts. It doesn't affect us as much as it does at the beginning. And that we actually can see in horses, and I'll show you that here in a second, where you get a decrease in the inflammatory response to exercise, and you actually get a corresponding increase in our anti-inflammatory system. And so you almost reach more of an equilibrium or a kind of a steady state where they will oppose each other as horses or as humans adapt to their exercise. So this is from some data that we published a couple years ago. What we have here, and I think you'll see it again in a little bit, is an inflammation score. It is an average of multiple pro-inflammatory genes that we've averaged together into one value to give us kind of an easier to interpret value. And anything above this 0 line, which you'll see go across, would be an increase in inflammation, and anything below that would be actually a decrease. And so what we did is we took 2 groups of thoroughbreds. Group A was breezed, these were, I should mention, First 2 weeks were before these horses began any high-speed exercise training. And so they were, as you can see at the beginning of the study, they were very similar to each other. Group A breezed twice a week over a synthetic track, while Group B actually breezed once a week over a turf track. And what we expect is we expect to see a decrease in that inflammation over time. But in fact, what we see is that group that breezes once a week does have a decrease over time. That group that breezes twice a week actually goes up. And so this twice a week breezing has kind of fallen out of favor a little bit. It's known to be a little bit more of a risk factor for things like bucked shins in these horses and more time off. And so we start to see why. And so from the data, we hypothesized that while some inflammation is necessary for healing and repair of muscle and bone, we actually could be seeing an exaggerated response that may make these horses at risk for injury. And so that leads me to the research that I just want to talk about today. It's recently been published, and that title of that paper is actually a little bit different than it is here, but it's the comparison of pre-race inflammatory marker mRNA expression and race-related parameters in thoroughbred. It's almost like we get paid per character that we put in these journal articles we don't. So for this project, we took a single Tempest tube, which is that commercially available tube that I talked about, and they were collected over a 60-day period from a single racetrack here in Kentucky. Those samples were collected for us by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, and they were collected during pre-race total CO2 testing. And so that consisted of 1 to 2 randomly selected races per day, as well as all graded stakes races that took place during that 60-day period. In total for this project, we actually had 500 samples collected, so it's a pretty good number of samples. We looked at 5 different pro-inflammatory genes. So I mentioned interleukin 1. We also looked at interleukin 6, interleukin 8, interleukin 17, and also tumor necrosis factor alpha. So a good wide variety of pro-inflammatory markers. We collected a variety of data from publicly available records with Equibase, and then also under a license from the Jockey Club Information Systems, obtained data regarding the number of starts and the days between starts during that year, which I'll show you here in a minute. To take a minute to orient you to these graphs, because they'll all look very similar, because they are a little bit on the busy side. So you'll see 5 different bars representing the individual markers that I've mentioned. And then much like that inflammation score I showed you earlier, we did, for one of those bars, it'll be the solid black bar, average all 5 of them together. So we looked at a variety of different aspects with regards to race parameters. And so the first one we looked at was race category. So was the horse entered into an allowance race, a claimings race, or a stakes race going across here? And what we found is those horses that were in graded stakes races had significantly lower interleukin 1, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and then an average of all 5 together when compared to the allowance and the claiming horses. And so where there were no differences between those allowance and claiming horses, probably have from the starts and the intervals between starts a little bit of an explanation of that coming up. We also wanted to look at, did the post-time favorite, based on its odds, finish in the top 3 or outside of the top 3? So a yes over here means they were the post-time favorite and they finished in the top 3 or in the money. No means they finished outside of the top 3. And what we found was interleukin 6, which is a marker we've been interested in now for a while, was significantly elevated in those horses that didn't perform up to what was predicted compared to those that did. We looked at a variety of other parameters. Obviously, when you collect a large amount of data, you can look at a variety of different things. And we found no significant differences based on the age of the horse, the sex of the horse, and whether they were simply the favorite by the post-time odds. We also had illusions of grandeur and early retirement, and so we were hoping that we could be able to predict whether a horse would finish in the money, in the top 3, or whether they would win. And here we are this morning, so that probably tells you how well we did predicting that. So this is the data we obtained from the Jockey Club Information Systems, and to orient you a little bit, we looked at, we broke down horses based on whether for the year in which this study took place, 50% or more of their starts were in a claiming race, an allowance race, or in a graded stakes race. And then we took the North American average for those values And then also broke it out by Kentucky. So a horse that had one or more starts in Kentucky during the study year would be here, but also be represented in North America. And not surprisingly, this is, again, none of this was earth-shattering to us, but it was still good to look at. Claiming race horses had more starts compared to the others. Allowance, at least in the North American average, was pretty similar to graded stakes races. Interestingly, the Kentucky horses actually had more of all three of these categories when compared to the North American average. We also looked at the average interval, the number of days between starts, again based on whether most of the races were in a claiming race, allowance race, or graded stakes race. And once again found that claiming horses start or have a shorter interval between races. Allowance race horses were kind of in between, and again, not surprisingly, graded stakes race horses have the most amount of time off between races. Start to wonder if that may be the explanation that we see for the reason the graded stakes race horses had evidence of lower inflammation compared to the other two. The other thing we wanted to do is we wanted to look at claiming prices. Claiming horses have been identified through work with the equine injury database as being at a higher risk for catastrophic injury, and so we were interested in looking at whether claiming prices had any effect on that. So it's broken down by horses that were up for claiming at a price of less than $10,000, $10,000 to $25,000, $25,000 or more, or they just weren't up for a claiming tag. And what we found is this group of horses that was in the $25,000 or more, they do a lot of movement back and forth between trainers. They had significantly increased interleukin-1 tumor necrosis factor in that 5-month average compared to the horses that were not up for claiming. Interestingly, this group was less than $10,000. I'm not really sure why that is, but it still reinforces the fact that this is a group that is particularly at risk for catastrophic injuries and probably worth some additional investigation. So to conclude, I know I've kind of flown through this, but pre-race inflammatory gene expression was not associated with performance in a given race, although it does appear to be associated with the caliber or ability of these racehorses, and that increased expression, especially that we see in lower caliber horses, may be due to that short race-to-race interval that I pointed out. And again, some of the data here supports industry's focus on claiming horses and their increased risk for injury, although additional work is certainly needed to determine whether this sort of analysis can be used to support the racing industry and their efforts to improve racehorse welfare. Real briefly, so we have a lot of different projects going on in our lab. The two that we're the most interested in and to bring up to you guys is, one, can the inflammatory response that I've showed you here be affected by non-steroidal administration? As I mentioned in kind of the intro, we know that inflammation is important for repair and adaptation of bones and soft tissue. By giving non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, especially these younger horses, can we potentially negatively affect that? And that would maybe down the line make those horses at risk for injury. So we're interested in looking at that. And then also what we're really excited about is a project that we have ongoing, and our preliminary data is quite exciting, and looking at whether we can use this inflammatory mRNA analysis to possibly predict catastrophic injuries in racehorses. And so with that, again, I do want to acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. David Horhoff and Craig Stewart from here at the Block Center, as well as Dr. Mary Scalay for her time at the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you guys have. Yes, sir.
The middle to high-end claim horses you're saying is at higher risk. Have you determined why they would be?
So there's some thought that those higher claiming horses may move between trainers a little bit more than potentially the lower claimers. We didn't look at the history or after we got those samples what those horses did as far as claiming movement. But that movement between trainers has been definitely associated with an increased risk for injury.
Did they have more starts?
We didn't. The Jockey Club data is hard to deal with because you end up asking them what you want and they provide it to you. You don't actually get the raw data. And so we didn't break it out by horse to look at that sort of thing, unfortunately. It would have certainly been interesting. And going forward, I think if we do pursue that sort of data, there's a lot more we probably will do with it. Yeah?
You couldn't predict what who was going to be in the top 3 of the draft. We
So, it's a great question. So the question is, if we can't predict who's going to finish, high up in the race, why do we think we can predict a catastrophic breakdown? The research that has been done in catastrophic injuries has shown that over 90% of these horses have pre-existing pathologic damage. So whether it be in the leg that ends up breaking down or in the opposite limb. And so what we're doing here with this messenger RNA analysis, it is really sensitive to small changes in inflammation. And so a lot of that damage that we see in those breakdown horses is often related to a stress fracture that finally propagates into a big fracture. And that stress fracture will be enough to elicit a mild inflammatory response. It may not be enough to make the horses lame, it may not be enough to get heat and swelling, but it is enough to set off what we're looking at. We're not looking at very large changes. We're talking maybe a 1 or 2-fold change. But we've looked at enough of these horses that we know what a population of horses should look like, and anything above that is certainly enough to get our attention. So that's an excellent question.
So, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Apply that to racing, would you then, if you could prove it and say this is the baseline, do you think racing would bring in something and say, well, we're going to test all horses before racing, and if your horse comes up with inflammation responses greater than this, we're going to scratch that horse?
Sure. So the question for those of you who can hear is, if our breakdown data does work out and we are able to predict those, maybe how would that be rolled out? I think that's an interesting, it's a great question, and probably one that's better handled by the racing jurisdictions as far as how they would do it. We've never looked at this as being this is high, you should scratch this horse. We've always seen it in the future as this is high, this horse needs to be looked at more closely probably before it goes in racing, whether it's advanced imaging or more in-depth exam, that sort of thing. We may get there. I mean, that certainly would be the hope. It's, especially when you talk about something like a standing MRI or a CT scan. This is a lot cheaper than that, and it's not quite as fast. It takes 1 or 2 days, but it still would be a lot less.
You did. So I know that you, in your research, saw that stakes runners tended to have lower inflammation responses. Did you look at the difference between stakes runners and stakes winners, and see if winners potentially have even lower?
We didn't because one of the issues, so we had 500 samples. While we had a decent number of stakes horses that we could look at them as a group, if we didn't have enough within that subset to break them out based on that we felt like our statistics would be valid.
So I was wondering if you think this might be more of a correlation or causation, and if horses that have less inflammatory responses tend to run in stakes races and things like that because of those things.
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to look at with graded stakes races is often, horses will be on different paths, and there is, typically a 4, maybe even a 5-week break as opposed to these horses that are running and claiming an allowance races where they run them more often. And so whether, it's a great question, one of the ones we asked in that paper, and we're not sure, is their inflammation lower because they aren't running as frequently? Or is their inflammation lower because they are in better shape and therefore better geared towards graded stakes races? We don't know. It's a question that's really difficult to answer, if almost impossible. Yeah, absolutely. Sir?
On a practical note, from the time you draw this blood, what's the turnaround time?
So
at the racetrack.
So it's not a test that can be run really at the racetrack. Typically, once we receive the samples, it's about a 48-hour turnaround. So if it's something that can be brought to us, it's something that we brought early in the morning, we can probably get it back 2 days later. If it's shipped, depends on when FedEx or UPS drops it off. So it's about a 2 or 3 business day turnaround. So our hope is we'll be able to take those markers or even the markers we identified potentially in our breakdown study and maybe develop a quicker assay that can be done in local labs. What we're doing is require some specialized equipment, but if we can potentially make it easier, a lot of the PCR equipment that's out there is becoming smaller, more affordable for smaller labs to run. So it's possible that we can cut that down as well. Yeah.
The Kentucky horses had a greater number of starts around on average compared to other North American horses. Did you find that they had more catastrophic injuries or more inflammation like those horses that had more starts?
So we didn't look at injuries in this group of horses. Again, over a 60-day period, with 500 horses, that's we would expect less than one breakdown. I don't even remember, I think maybe it was one horse that was fanned off, and I don't actually even know if it was a breakdown or if it just needed to be fanned off. So we didn't look at those, and we don't know why that average was, why all those values for Kentucky were higher than they were in North America. I mean, obviously we have a lot of opportunities for different races year-round here in Kentucky as opposed to North America. You have the big circuits, but the smaller circuits don't have year-round racing, and that can certainly play a role. Okay, excellent. Thank you all very much.